In the 13th century before the Common Era, the Nile River Valley sustained a civilization organized around the person of the pharaoh, who was understood to be both king and living deity, the intermediary between the gods and the people of the two lands. The administrative structure of Egypt at this time rested on centuries of accumulated tradition, with provincial governors managing agricultural surpluses, temple priests maintaining ritual schedules, and scribes recording transactions in hieratic script on papyrus scrolls that would be stored in palace archives. The new kingdom, which had begun some 3 centuries earlier with the expulsion of foreign rulers from the Delta, represented a period of territorial expansion and cultural consolidation, during which Egyptian armies campaigned regularly in the Levant and Nubia, bringing back tribute and establishing Egypt as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean world. The religious landscape of Egypt during this period centered on the worship of Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, whose primary cult center at Karnak in Thebes had grown wealthy through royal patronage and controlled vast estates worked by dependent laborers. Temples functioned not merely as places of worship, but as economic institutions that owned land, employed craftsmen, and stored grain reserves that could sustain urban populations during times of scarcity. The priesthood of Amun had accumulated considerable political influence through its control of temple revenues and its role in legitimizing royal succession through oracles and ritual confirmations. Daily temple service followed a fixed pattern, with priests performing purification rites before dawn, opening the shrine of the god's statue, making offerings of food and incense, reciting prescribed hymns, and sealing the sanctuary again before withdrawing. This rhythm of ritual activity had continued uninterrupted for generations, creating a sense of cosmic order that Egyptians believed necessary for the continued functioning of the world. The pharaoh occupied a unique position within this system, serving as the chief priest of all the gods, while simultaneously acting as military commander, supreme judge, and owner of all land in Egypt. Royal ideology held that the king maintained Ma'at, the principle of truth, justice, and cosmic balance, through proper performance of ritual obligations and through the establishment of temples and monuments that would endure for eternity. The succession of pharaohs was theoretically unbroken, each king being identified with Horus during his lifetime and with Osiris after death, creating a continuous chain of divine kingship extending back to the first dynasties. Royal inscriptions emphasized the king's role as builder, conqueror, and protector of Egypt's borders, though the actual exercise of power involved extensive consultation with advisors and delegation of authority to officials who managed day-to-day administration of the kingdom. The royal court at Thebes during the late 18th dynasty consisted of numerous officials whose titles reflected both actual administrative functions and honorific appointments that conveyed status without specific duties. The vizier, holding the highest administrative office, supervised tax collection, oversaw construction projects, heard legal appeals, and coordinated the activities of provincial governors. Military commanders led divisions of professional soldiers as well as conscripted laborers who could be mobilized for campaigns or for work on royal building projects. The royal treasurer managed the wealth that flowed into Egypt from its territories and from trade relations with neighboring lands, while the chief scribe of the royal archives maintained records of land ownership, temple endowments, and diplomatic correspondence. These officials came from families that had served the crown for generations, creating networks of kinship and patronage that bound the administrative elite together and ensured continuity of governance even during transitions between reigns. In the middle years of the 14th century before the Common Era, the religious and political structure of Egypt underwent a significant disruption when the pharaoh Amenhotep IV initiated changes to traditional temple practice and royal iconography. This king, who would later change his name to Akhenaten, promoted the worship of the Aten, the sun disk, as the sole deity deserving of royal patronage, and established a new capital city in Middle Egypt called Akhetaten, known in modern times as Amarna. The reasoning behind these changes remains a subject of scholarly discussion, though inscriptions from the period emphasize the Aten's universal creative power and the king's unique relationship with this deity. The practical effects of these policies included the redirection of resources away from the traditional temples, particularly the cult of Amun at Thebes, the creation of a new artistic style that depicted the royal family in unprecedented ways, and the reorganization of the royal court around a different set of rituals and administrative priorities. The religious changes instituted during this period did not represent a complete abandonment of Egyptian tradition, but rather a selective emphasis on elements that had long existed within the broader framework of Egyptian religion. The sun had been worshipped throughout Egyptian history under various names and forms, and the notion of a universal creator deity was not itself novel. What distinguished the Aten cult was its exclusive claim to royal patronage and its rejection of the traditional polytheistic framework in which multiple gods governed different aspects of the cosmos. Temples built for the Aten featured open courtyards exposed to sunlight rather than the dark sanctuaries typical of traditional Egyptian temples, and the king and queen were shown participating directly in cult activities rather than being represented by priests acting on their behalf. Inscriptions from this period describe the Aten as the creator of all lands and peoples, who provides for all living things through the sun's daily cycle of rising and setting. The impact of these religious changes on the broader population of Egypt varied depending on social position and location. The majority of Egyptians continued to live in agricultural villages along the Nile, where the annual flood cycle determined the rhythm of planting and harvest, and where local shrines to traditional deities likely continued to function, despite the official redirection of royal patronage. For the elite who served at court and in temple administration, however, the changes represented a significant disruption to established career paths and sources of patronage. Families that had held hereditary priesthoods in the cult of Amun found their positions diminished or eliminated, while those willing to adopt the new religious framework found opportunities for advancement in the service of the Aten cult. The artistic workshops that had traditionally produced temple statuary and relief decoration adapted to the new style mandated by the court, creating images that emphasized the king's elongated features and the intimate domestic scenes of the royal family. The city of Akhetaten was constructed rapidly on virgin land along the eastern bank of the Nile, its boundaries marked by stelae carved into the surrounding cliffs that recorded the king's oath never to extend the city beyond these limits. The layout of the city included a great temple to the Aten, administrative buildings, residential quarters for officials and workers, and a royal palace complex that served as the center of government. Archaeological investigation of the site has revealed details of daily life in this purpose-built capital, including the remains of houses, workshops where artists produced statuary and painted reliefs, and cemeteries where officials who served the court were buried in tombs decorated with hymns to the Aten, and scenes of the king and queen making offerings. The city functioned as the administrative center of Egypt for approximately 15 years before being abandoned following the death of Akhenaten and the restoration of traditional religious practices under his successors. During the later years of Akhenaten's reign, evidence suggests that the king shared power with a co-regent, though the identity and precise status of this figure remains uncertain based on surviving inscriptions. Some monuments from this period name a king called Ankheperure Neferneferuaten, whose relationship to Akhenaten and whose gender have been subjects of scholarly debate. Following Akhenaten's death, this co-regent appears to have ruled briefly before the accession of a young king whose birth name was Tutankhamun, meaning living image of the Aten, reflecting the religious framework of the period in which he was born. The circumstances of this succession, including the familial relationships between these individuals, cannot be established with certainty from surviving evidence, though inscriptions and artistic representations provide some indication of continuity between the late Amarna period and the early years of the new reign. The young king who came to the throne under the name Tutankhamun was born during the period of Akhenaten's rule, and the limited evidence concerning his early childhood suggests that he grew up within the royal household at Akhetaten. Royal children in Egypt were raised within the women's quarters of the palace, where they were cared for by nurses and attendants while receiving instruction appropriate to their status. For a child designated as heir to the throne, this education would have included learning to read and write hieratic script, studying the traditional wisdom literature that conveyed ethical principles and proper conduct, and observing the ritual duties performed by the reigning king. The extent to which the young Tutankhamun participated in the Aten cult during his early childhood would have depended on his exact age and his position within the royal family, though he would certainly have witnessed the daily offerings and hymns that constituted the public worship of the solar deity. The household of a royal child included wet nurses who nursed and cared for the infant, tutors who provided instruction in literacy and royal protocol, and companions from families of the nobility who would later serve as officials and advisors during the child's reign. These early relationships created bonds of affection and obligation that could influence appointments and policies in later years. The physical environment of the palace at Akhetaten, with its open courtyards and painted columns depicting natural scenes, provided a setting quite different from the traditional palace complexes at Thebes and Memphis and the artistic style of the period emphasized. Naturalistic depictions of plant and animal life that may have shaped the young prince's aesthetic sensibilities. Daily life in the royal household followed patterns of ritual purification, meals taken at prescribed times, instruction in proper speech and deportment, and periods of leisure during which the child might observe craftsmen at work or participate in games and physical activities appropriate to royal status. At some point during his childhood, Tutankhamun was designated as the heir who would succeed to the throne of Egypt, though the process by which this designation occurred remains unclear from surviving evidence. Royal succession in Egypt followed patrilineal principles in theory, with the throne passing from father to son, but practice often involved more complex arrangements when the previous king died without a surviving son of appropriate age, or when political circumstances required accommodation of competing claims. The legitimacy of a new king could be strengthened through marriage to a daughter of the previous king, creating a connection to the royal bloodline through both paternal and maternal descent. In Tutankhamun's case, his marriage to Ankhesenpaten, a daughter of Akhenaten, and his principal wife, Nefertiti, appears to have occurred either just before or shortly after his accession to the throne, following patterns of royal marriage practice that had long been customary in Egypt. The accession of a new king in Egypt involved a series of rituals designed to effect the transformation of a mortal individual into a living god. These ceremonies included purification rites performed by priests, the placing of royal regalia on the body of the new king, recitation of spells and hymns that invoked the protection of the gods, and formal presentation of the king to the assembled court and officials who would serve during his reign. The coronation also involved the assignment of a throne name, chosen to reflect the king's relationship with the gods. and his role as maintainer of Ma'at. In the case of the young king who had been born Tutankhamun, this transition occurred at an age estimated by physical anthropological study of his remains to have been approximately 8 to 10 years, making him one of the youngest individuals to assume the throne of Egypt in its long history. The governance of the kingdom during these early years would necessarily have relied heavily on advisors and officials who managed daily administration, while the young king underwent training in the responsibilities of kingship. The first years of Tutankhamun's reign coincided with a period of significant political and religious transition, as the court began the process of restoring traditional practices that had been disrupted during Akhenaten's rule. Evidence for this restoration comes from several sources, including a limestone stela found at Karnak that describes in detail the state of the temples and cult practices at the time of the young king's accession and the measures taken to restore proper functioning of religious institutions. This inscription, though set up in the name of the king, likely reflects decisions made by the officials who guided policy during the early years of the reign, particularly the Vizier I and the military commander Horemheb, both of whom had served during the previous regime and who would play crucial roles in the post-Amarna period. The stela describes temples that had fallen into disrepair, cult statues that were no longer receiving offerings, priesthoods that had been disbanded, and festivals that had ceased to be celebrated, though the extent to which these descriptions reflect actual conditions or represent rhetorical exaggeration designed to emphasize the piety of the restoration remains a subject of scholarly discussion. The measures taken to restore traditional religious practice included the reopening of temples to Amun and other gods of the traditional pantheon, the reinstatement of priesthoods with endowments sufficient to maintain daily offerings, the repair of cult statues and temple buildings that had deteriorated during the period of neglect, and the resumption of the great festivals that marked the ritual calendar of the Egyptian year. These changes required significant expenditure of resources drawn from the royal treasury and from revenues that had previously been directed to the Aten cult. The workshops of craftsmen employed by the temples resumed production of ritual objects, statuary, and relief decoration according to traditional canons of proportion and iconography, moving away from the distinctive Amarna style that had characterized royal art during the previous reign. Scribes copied out ritual texts that prescribed the proper performance of daily temple service and the correct recitation of hymns and spells, ensuring that priests newly installed in these positions had access to the knowledge necessary for maintaining cult practice. As part of this restoration process, the young king changed his name from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun, replacing the reference to the Aten with a reference to Amun, the king of the gods, whose cult at Thebes had been the primary victim of Akhenaten's religious policies. Similarly, his queen changed her name from Ankhesenpaten to Ankhesenamun, making the same substitution. These name changes, recorded in inscriptions from this period, signaled the official abandonment of exclusive Aten worship and the return to traditional polytheistic practice. The capital city of Akhetaten was gradually abandoned as the royal court returned to the traditional administrative centers at Memphis and Thebes, though the process of abandonment appears to have occurred over several years rather than as an immediate evacuation. Officials who had maintained residences and tomb chapels at Akhetaten redirected their resources to establishing themselves at the traditional centers of power, where they could participate in the restored cult of Amun and compete for the patronage that would be distributed through conventional channels. The royal residence during Tutankhamun's reign appears to have been divided between Memphis in the north, which served as the traditional administrative capital, and Thebes in the south, where the great temples of Amun at Karnak and Luxor required the king's presence for major festivals and where the royal mortuary temples on the West Bank maintained the cults of deceased kings. The palace at Memphis, located near the ancient pyramid complexes of the Old Kingdom, had served as a royal residence for centuries and contained administrative offices, residential quarters for the royal family, workshops for craftsmen, and storage facilities for the goods and tribute that flowed into the capital from the provinces and from Egypt's territories abroad. Daily life at the palace followed patterns of formal audiences during which the king received officials and foreign envoys, periods of ritual activity including offerings at temple shrines within the palace complex, meals taken with members of the royal family and favored courtiers, and instruction in various aspects of kingship, including military training, literacy in hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts, and the study of ritual texts. The young king's daily routine would have begun with ritual ablutions performed by attendants who purified his body and dressed him in the elaborate ceremonial costume appropriate to his divine status. The morning might include offerings at a shrine within the palace, after which the king would receive reports from officials concerning administrative matters requiring royal attention or approval. These audiences followed formal protocols, with officials approaching the king with proper gestures of respect and addressing him using the elaborate titles that emphasized his role as Lord of the Two Lands and Son of the Gods. Scribes recorded decisions made during these audiences and dispatched copies of royal decrees to relevant officials responsible for implementation. The middle portion of the day might be devoted to physical activities including archery practice, chariot driving, and other military exercises designed to maintain the physical prowess expected of a king who was theoretically the supreme military commander of Egypt's armies. Instruction in literacy occupied significant portions of time for a young king who needed to master not only the hieratic script used for everyday administrative documents, but also the hieroglyphic script used for monumental inscriptions and religious texts. The curriculum would have included the study of traditional wisdom literature, collections of maxims and instructions concerning proper conduct that had been copied and studied for generations, as well as exposure to the mythological and religious texts that explained the origins of the gods and the rituals required for their proper worship. Tutankhamun, like other kings, would have been expected to demonstrate his mastery of these texts through his ability to participate in temple rituals that required the recitation of specific spells and hymns at appropriate moments in the ceremonial sequence. The extent to which the young king actually composed any of the inscriptions set up in his name remains uncertain, as the production of royal texts typically involved collaboration between the king and learned scribes who possessed specialized knowledge of traditional phraseology and proper formulaic expressions. The court that surrounded Tutankhamun during his reign included officials who had served under previous kings and who possessed the expertise necessary for managing the complex administrative machinery of the Egyptian state. The vizier, who held the highest office beneath the king, functioned as chief administrator responsible for coordinating the activities of various departments and for ensuring that tax revenues were collected and properly accounted for. During Tutankhamun's reign, the Vizier I appears to have exercised considerable influence over policy decisions, using his position to advance members of his own family and to establish himself as the preeminent figure at court after the king himself. I's titles included God's Father, which may have indicated a family relationship to the royal line, though the precise nature of this connection cannot be established with certainty from surviving evidence. His long career in royal service, which appears to have begun during the reign of Amenhotep III and continued through the Amarna period, gave him unparalleled knowledge of court politics and administrative procedure. The military commander Horemheb represented another powerful figure at court during Tutankhamun's reign. holding titles that indicated his authority over the army and his role in conducting military campaigns in Egypt's territories abroad. Horemheb's background appears to have been that of a military officer who rose through the ranks based on competence and loyalty rather than through family connections to the royal line. His titles included Deputy of the King in the entire land, suggesting broad administrative authority beyond purely military matters, and inscriptions from his tomb at Saqqara depict him receiving rewards from the king and participating in ceremonies alongside other high officials. The relationship between Horemheb and Ai appears to have been one of pragmatic cooperation in managing the kingdom during the king's minority, though their respective spheres of influence likely involved some degree of competition for royal favor and for the distribution of patronage. The treasurer, Maya, managed the royal finances during Tutankhamun's reign, overseeing the collection of taxes, the disbursement of funds for building projects and military campaigns, and the proper accounting of royal revenues. His tomb at Saqqara, discovered and excavated in modern times, contained reliefs depicting him in the exercise of his official duties, as well as scenes of his rewarding by the king for faithful service. The position of treasurer required detailed knowledge of accounting procedures, familiarity with the weights and measures used in commercial transactions, and the ability to detect fraud or misappropriation of royal property by subordinate officials. The treasurer worked closely with the vizier in matters concerning taxation and with military commanders in provisioning armies for campaigns, making this position central to the functioning of the state apparatus. Religious officials, particularly the high priest of Amun at Thebes, recovered significant influence during Tutankhamun's reign, as the restoration of traditional cult practice required the appointment of priests capable of performing the complex rituals associated with temple service. The high priest controlled vast estates and commanded resources that made the priesthood of Amun one of the wealthiest institutions in Egypt, and the holder of this office necessarily maintained close relations with the royal court, while also representing the interests of the temple establishment. Inscriptions from this period record donations made by the king to various temples, including gifts of land, statues of gods fashioned from precious materials, and endowments of offering goods required for daily temple service. These donations functioned not merely as expressions of piety, but as mechanisms for redistributing wealth and for creating networks of obligation that bound temple personnel to the crown. The physical appearance of the king, as reconstructed from examination of his mummified remains and from artistic representations created during his lifetime, shows a young man of slight build whose physical development appears to have been affected by genetic conditions inherited from generations of royal inbreeding. Medical examination of the mummy has identified skeletal abnormalities, including a clubfoot and curvature of the spine, conditions that would have affected his mobility and that may have required the use of walking sticks, numerous examples of which were found in his tomb. The artistic representations of Tutankhamun created during his reign generally followed traditional conventions that depicted the king in idealized form, showing him as a vigorous young man capable of physical feats, including hunting wild animals and participating in military campaigns, though whether the king actually engaged in such activities remains uncertain given his physical limitations. The king's appearance in ceremonial contexts involved the wearing of elaborate crowns and regalia that symbolized his authority as ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. The various crowns used by Egyptian kings included the white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, and the blue crown, which, despite its modern designation as a war crown, appears to have been worn in a variety of contexts, including religious ceremonies and formal audiences. The king's ceremonial costume included a false beard attached to the chin, Broad collar necklaces made of gold and semi-precious stones, kilts of fine linen ornamented with decorative panels, and sandals of leather or papyrus. For certain rituals, the king wore animal tails attached to his belt, a feature that connected him symbolically with the power and vitality of wild animals. The process of dressing the king for ceremonial appearances required the assistance of attendants who specialized in the handling of these precious objects and who understood the proper sequence in which different elements of the costume should be put on. Tutankhamun's marriage to Ankhesenamun, his half-sister and the daughter of Akhenaten, followed patterns of royal marriage that sought to maintain the purity of the royal bloodline and to strengthen claims to legitimate succession. Evidence from the king's tomb suggests that the couple experienced at least 2 pregnancies that ended in stillbirth, with the mummified remains of 2 fetuses being placed in small coffins that were interred with the king. These unsuccessful pregnancies may have been related to the genetic problems resulting from the close family relationships common in the royal family, which had practiced sibling marriage for generations as a means of concentrating divine royal blood. The emotional impact of these losses on the king and queen cannot be determined from the archaeological record, though their inability to produce an heir who survived infancy would have significant consequences for the succession following Tutankhamun's death. The artistic production during Tutankhamun's reign shows a gradual transition away from the distinctive Amarna style toward more traditional forms of representation, though elements of the naturalism and intimacy characteristic of Amarna art continued to influence royal iconography. Reliefs created during this period depict the king and queen in domestic settings, seated together in positions of affection, a theme that had been developed extensively during the Amarna period, but that was less common in traditional Egyptian royal art. The return to traditional canons of proportion and the restoration of conventional iconography occurred gradually rather than abruptly, with workshops adapting their techniques over several years as they responded to changing royal preferences and to the need to train new generations of artists who had not been active during the Amarna period. The major temples received new statuary and relief decoration during Tutankhamun's reign, including colossal statues of the king set up at Karnak and images of the king making offerings to Amun and other gods of the traditional pantheon. Building projects undertaken during Tutankhamun's reign included additions to the great temple complex at Karnak, where the king completed work on several structures begun by his predecessors and initiated new construction that would be continued by later kings. The colonnade hall at Luxor Temple received decorated walls showing the annual Opet festival, during which the statue of Amun was carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor in a celebration that reaffirmed the king's divine nature and his special relationship with the god. These reliefs depicted the king leading priests in the carrying of the divine bark, making offerings at stations along the processional route, and participating in rituals within the temple itself. The execution of this decoration required teams of skilled craftsmen working under the direction of master sculptors who knew the proper proportions and the traditional scenes appropriate for temple walls. The workshops that produced objects for royal use during Tutankhamun's reign created items of extraordinary craftsmanship, including furniture inlaid with ebony, ivory, and gold, vessels of alabaster and other semi-precious stones, weapons decorated with scenes of the king in military triumph, and jewelry incorporating complex techniques of gold working and stone setting. These objects, many of which were ultimately placed in the king's tomb, demonstrate the technical sophistication of Egyptian craftsmen and the resources available for royal commissions. The production of such items required access to materials imported from distant regions, including gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, turquoise from the Sinai, and ebony from Central Africa, materials that arrived in Egypt as tribute from subject territories or as goods obtained through trade networks that extended across the ancient Near East. Military activity during Tutankhamun's reign appears to have focused primarily on maintaining control over Egypt's established territories in Nubia and the Levant, rather than on aggressive campaigns of expansion. Inscriptions from this period mention expeditions to Syria, though the extent and nature of these campaigns remains unclear from the limited evidence available. The maintenance of Egyptian authority in these regions required periodic demonstrations of military force, the garrisoning of strategic locations with Egyptian troops, and the appointment of local rulers willing to acknowledge Egyptian suzerainty and to remit tribute to the pharaoh. The military establishment during this period included professional soldiers who served in specialized units, conscripted laborers who could be mobilized for campaigns or for work on fortifications, and foreign mercenaries who fought for Egyptian gold and provisions. The organization of military expeditions required extensive logistical planning to ensure adequate supplies of food, water, and equipment for troops operating far from the Nile Valley. The royal hunt, whether or not the king actually participated given his physical limitations, functioned as an important symbol of royal power and as a demonstration of the king's ability to maintain order by subduing the forces of chaos represented by dangerous wild animals. Artistic representations from Tutankhamun's reign show the king hunting lions, wild bulls, and ostriches, activities that connected him with a long tradition of royal hunting scenes in Egyptian art. The painted chest found in Tutankhamun's tomb depicts the king in his chariot shooting arrows at fleeing enemies and at wild animals, images that conveyed the king's prowess as warrior and hunter, regardless of whether these scenes represented actual events or idealized depictions of royal capability. Hunting expeditions, when they occurred, would have involved large retinues of attendants, beaters, to drive game toward the king, and specialized personnel responsible for the care and management of hunting dogs and trained animals used in the chase. The festival calendar that governed the rhythm of religious life in Egypt included numerous occasions throughout the year when the king was expected to participate in ceremonies at various temples. The most important of these festivals included the Opet festival at Thebes, during which the renewal of the king's divine power was ritually enacted, the beautiful festival of the Valley, which involved processions to the royal mortuary temples on the west bank of the Nile, and the New Year's festival, which celebrated the annual inundation of the Nile and the renewal of fertility. Each of these occasions required extensive preparations, including the gathering of offerings, the purification of temple precincts, the assembling of priests and musicians who would participate in processions, and the preparation of the divine bark in which the statue of the god would be carried. The king's participation in these festivals involved not only his physical presence, but his performance of specific ritual actions, including the presentation of offerings, the recitation of prescribed texts, and the making of gestures that acknowledged the god's power and affirmed the king's role as intermediary between divine and human realms. Daily life for Tutankhamun, beyond the ritual and ceremonial obligations of kingship, included time for leisure activities appropriate to his royal status. The objects found in his tomb suggest interests in board games, including examples of the game of Senet, which combined elements of strategy and chance, and which held religious significance related to the journey of the deceased through the afterlife. The king's collection of walking sticks, many of which were elaborately decorated with gold and inlay, may have served practical purposes given his mobility issues, while also functioning as symbols of authority carried during ceremonial appearances. Hunting equipment found in the tomb, including bows, arrows, and throwing sticks, may have been used by the king in practice sessions, even if his physical condition prevented active participation in actual hunts. The presence of numerous items related to personal grooming and cosmetics, including mirrors, razors, and containers for oils and unguents, indicates attention to bodily appearance and to the maintenance of cleanliness through regular bathing and anointing with scented substances. The preparation for death and the afterlife, which occupied considerable resources during an Egyptian king's reign, involved the construction of a tomb in the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, where the kings of the New Kingdom had been buried since the early 18th dynasty. The selection of a tomb site in this secluded valley, hidden among the limestone cliffs, reflected concerns about security and the protection of the royal burial from tomb robbers who might be attracted by the valuable goods placed in the tomb to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The construction of a royal tomb required teams of skilled workers who cut chambers into the living rock, plasterers who prepared wall surfaces for decoration, and artists who painted the walls with scenes and texts. From the funerary literature designed to guide the king safely through the dangers of the underworld and to ensure his resurrection and eternal life among the gods. The tomb prepared for Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings appears to have been originally intended for a private individual rather than for a king, based on its relatively small size and limited decoration compared to other royal tombs in the valley. The reasons for the use of this modest tomb for a king remain uncertain, though the circumstances of Tutankhamun's death at a young age may have necessitated the rapid preparation of a burial place, requiring the appropriation of a tomb that was already partially complete rather than waiting for the completion of a larger, more elaborate structure. The tomb consisted of a descending corridor leading to an antechamber, beyond which lay the burial chamber containing the king's nested coffins and stone sarcophagus, with additional small chambers used for storage of burial goods. The walls of the burial chamber received decoration showing scenes from the Book of the Amduat, which described the sun god's nightly journey through the 12 hours of the underworld, and scenes showing the king in the company of various deities who would assist in his resurrection. The burial goods placed in Tutankhamun's tomb represented the most complete assemblage of royal funerary equipment ever discovered from ancient Egypt, providing detailed evidence for the types of objects considered necessary for a king's use in the afterlife. These items included not only ritual objects directly related to funerary practices, such as magical figures called shabtis that would perform labor on behalf of the deceased, canopic jars containing the king's preserved internal organs, and amulets placed within the mummy wrappings to protect the body, but also objects from daily life, including furniture, clothing, food and wine, weapons, and games. The tomb also contained numerous statues of the king and of various deities, models of boats that would transport the king across the celestial waters, and chests containing the regalia and ceremonial costumes that the king had worn during his lifetime. The careful arrangement of these objects within the limited space of the tomb chambers reflected beliefs about the organization of the afterlife and about the king's continued need for the objects and substances that had sustained him during his earthly existence. The process of mummification, which preserved the king's body for eternity, followed procedures that had been developed and refined over centuries of Egyptian practice. The body was taken to the embalming workshop, where specialized priests performed the various stages of preservation, including the removal of internal organs, the desiccation of the body using natron salt, the anointing of the preserved flesh with oils and resins, and the wrapping of the body in layer upon layer of linen bandages between which protective amulets were placed according to prescribed patterns. The entire process required 70 days to complete. during which time the priests recited spells and performed rituals designed to restore the deceased's faculties and to protect the body from decay and from malevolent forces that might threaten it. The mummified body was then placed in a series of nested coffins, the innermost made of solid gold, which were in turn placed within a stone sarcophagus that would protect them within the burial chamber. The reign of Tutankhamun ended with his death in the late 1320s before the Common Era, when the king was approximately 18 or 19 years old, based on examination of his skeletal remains. The cause of death has been the subject of extensive modern medical investigation, with various theories proposed including complications from malaria, infection resulting from a leg fracture, and genetic disorders related to the familial practice of sibling marriage. The evidence does not permit definitive conclusions about the immediate cause of death, though the combination of various health issues likely created a vulnerability to infections and complications that might not have proven fatal in a healthier individual. The sudden death of the young king, who had ruled for approximately 9 years, created a succession crisis as he left no surviving heir who could assume the throne. The funeral of Tutankhamun followed the traditional 70 days of mummification before the body was transported across the Nile to the Valley of the Kings for interment. The funeral procession would have included the mummy placed on a sledge and drawn by oxen, accompanied by priests performing purification rites and reciting funerary texts, professional mourners expressing ritual grief, and officials of the court who had served the king during his lifetime. The final ceremonies at the tomb entrance included the opening of the mouth ritual, during which priests touched implements to the face of the mummy and to statues of the king, symbolically restoring the deceased's ability to breathe, eat, and speak in the afterlife. The burial goods were arranged within the tomb chambers according to prescribed patterns, after which the entrance was sealed with stones and marked with the royal necropolis seal. Following Tutankhamun's burial, the throne of Egypt passed to the aged vizier Ai, who assumed the kingship and who is depicted in scenes on the wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, performing the opening of the mouth ceremony for his predecessor. Ai's brief reign of approximately 4 years maintained the policies of restoration that had been initiated under Tutankhamun, continuing the rebuilding of traditional temples and the re-establishment of cult practices that had been disrupted during the Amarna period. Ai's own tomb in the Western Valley, a branch of the Valley of the Kings, suggests that he had begun preparations for his burial even before becoming king, indicating perhaps that arrangements for the succession had been made before Tutankhamun's death. The circumstances of Ai's accession and his relationship to the royal family remain subjects of scholarly discussion, though his long career in royal service and his position as senior official at court gave him claim to succeed in the absence of a direct heir. The death of Ai after a brief reign brought Horemheb to the throne, the military commander who had served alongside Ai as one of the most powerful officials during Tutankhamun's reign. Horemheb's accession marked the effective end of the 18th dynasty, though later king lists would sometimes omit the names of the Amarna period kings and their immediate successors, beginning the 19th dynasty with Horemheb or with his successor Ramesses I. Horemheb's reign of approximately 28 years saw continued efforts to erase the memory of the Amarna period, with many monuments from the reigns of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ai being dismantled and their materials reused in new construction projects. The systematic removal of these kings' names from official records and the attribution of their accomplishments to other rulers represented an attempt to restore continuity with the period before Akhenaten's religious innovations, treating the Amarna period as an aberration that should be forgotten rather than remembered. The tomb of Tutankhamun sealed and hidden beneath debris from the cutting of later tombs in the valley, remained largely intact for more than 3,000 years, escaping the systematic robbery that emptied most of the other royal burials in the Valley of the Kings. The survival of this tomb, with most of its burial goods still in place, resulted from a combination of its modest size, which made it less conspicuous than the larger royal tombs, its location in a less prominent part of the valley, and the accumulation of limestone chips and debris from the construction of the tomb of Ramesses VI, which was cut into the hillside directly above Tutankhamun's burial, covering the entrance and making it difficult to locate. Evidence from the tomb indicates that it was entered by robbers twice in antiquity, shortly after the burial, when thieves removed small portable objects including gold, jewelry, and cosmetic oils, but on both occasions the intrusion was detected and the tomb was resealed by necropolis officials who reorganized the remaining burial goods and restored the seals on the doors. The memory of Tutankhamun faded from historical consciousness during antiquity, with his name appearing in king lists that recorded the succession of rulers, but without the accumulation of legendary material or attribution of significant accomplishments that attached to more prominent kings. The lack of major building projects that could be definitively attributed to him, the short duration of his reign, and the deliberate efforts by later rulers to minimize the historical significance of the post-Amarna period all contributed to the obscurity into which his memory fell. For scholars in later periods who studied ancient Egyptian history from surviving monuments and inscriptions, Tutankhamun appeared as a minor ruler of the 18th dynasty whose reign fell between the better documented periods of Egyptian imperial power under his predecessors and successors. The physical remains of Tutankhamun's tomb, located in the remote Valley of the Kings, weathered the centuries undisturbed, save for the minor ancient robberies and the gradual accumulation of debris that eventually covered even the memory of its location. The painted decoration on the burial chamber walls, protected from light and atmospheric moisture by the sealed chambers, retained its colors with remarkable freshness, though the organic materials among the burial goods underwent slow deterioration even in the protected environment of the tomb. The linen wrappings of the mummy absorbed resins that had been poured over the body during the burial ceremonies, creating a hard mass that preserved the bones while altering the soft tissues in ways that would later complicate efforts at medical examination. The limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, carved by seasonal flash floods over millennia, continued their slow geological transformation, while the political landscape of Egypt underwent successive transformations as the New Kingdom gave way to the Third Intermediate Period. Foreign rulers from Nubia and Assyria exercised temporary control over Egyptian territories. The Site dynasty briefly restored native rule before Persian conquest. The armies of Alexander the Great brought Egypt into the Hellenistic world. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled from Alexandria for 3 centuries, and finally, Roman annexation incorporated Egypt into an empire centered on the Mediterranean. Through all these changes, the sealed tomb remained hidden beneath the desert floor, its location known to no one, its contents undisturbed by the various peoples who successively controlled the Nile Valley. The abandonment of traditional Egyptian religion following the establishment of Christianity in late Roman Egypt meant the end of temple ritual and the cessation of the ancient scripts that had recorded the names and deeds of the pharaohs. The ability to read hieroglyphic inscriptions was lost, and with it went direct access to the extensive textual record that the Egyptians had left carved on temple walls, written on papyrus scrolls, and inscribed on the multitude of objects that filled their tombs. Medieval travelers to Egypt, both Muslim and Christian, viewed the ruins of temples and pyramids with wonder, but without understanding of the civilization that had produced them. European interest in Egyptian antiquities, which developed during the Renaissance and increased during the 18th and 19th centuries of the Common Era, initially focused on the removal of portable objects to museums and private collections, with less systematic attention to the archaeological context from which these objects came. The development of scientific archaeology during the 19th century brought new approaches to the investigation of ancient Egyptian sites, with excavators beginning to maintain detailed records of the locations where objects were found and to publish descriptions of tombs and their contents. The Valley of the Kings became a focus of archaeological activity, with various concessions granted to excavators who systematically cleared the known tombs and searched for new burials. By the early 20th century, most archaeologists believed that the valley had been thoroughly explored and that all significant tombs had been discovered, leading some to redirect their efforts to other sites that might prove more productive. The modest tomb of Tutankhamun remained hidden beneath the accumulated debris, awaiting the combination of persistence and fortune that would lead to its discovery. The eventual rediscovery of the tomb by the archaeologist Howard Carter in November of 1922 would bring Tutankhamun's name to international prominence and make his burial goods among the most widely known artifacts from ancient Egypt. The process of clearing the tomb and cataloging its contents required a decade of painstaking work, during which Carter and his team photographed, drew, and removed thousands of objects, creating a detailed record of one of the most complete royal burials ever found. The public fascination with the discovery, amplified by newspaper coverage and by the tragic death of Lord Carnarvon, who had financed the excavation, created a popular interest in ancient Egypt that persisted throughout the 20th century and into the present. The mummy of Tutankhamun, examined initially by Carter's team and subjected to more detailed investigation using modern medical imaging techniques in subsequent decades, provided physical evidence for understanding the king's health, his family relationships through DNA analysis, and the practices of royal mummification. The study of the burial goods illuminated aspects of daily life, religious beliefs, artistic practices, and technological capabilities during the late 18th dynasty, making this single tomb a uniquely important source for understanding ancient Egyptian civilization. The gold mask that covered the head of the mummy became one of the most recognizable images from the ancient world, reproduced in countless books, exhibitions, and popular media presentations. The historical significance of Tutankhamun derives less from his actions during his brief reign than from the accident of the tomb's survival, which preserved for study materials that had been lost from the burials of more powerful and long-lived kings. The young king who came to the throne during a period of transition, who presided over the restoration of traditional religious practices after the disruption of the Amarna period, and who died before reaching full adulthood, leaving no heir to continue his line, had not been remembered as a significant figure by the ancient Egyptians themselves. The survival of his burial with its extraordinary assemblage of objects created the conditions for his modern fame, demonstrating the role that preservation and discovery play in shaping historical memory. The objects from the tomb, distributed between the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and other institutions, continue to provide material for scholarly research into questions of chronology, artistic development, religious practice, and social organization during the New Kingdom. The tomb itself, open to visitors in the Valley of the Kings, shows the environmental stresses that result from modern tourism, with concerns about the preservation of the wall paintings leading to restrictions on access and to discussions about the creation of replica tombs that might reduce pressure on the original. The mummy of Tutankhamun, returned to the burial chamber after examination, rests in a climate-controlled case, where it can be viewed by visitors while being protected from environmental fluctuations. The process by which a minor king from Egypt's distant past became a global cultural icon reflects broader patterns in the reception of ancient cultures and in the ways that archaeological discoveries can reshape popular understanding of history. The treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb, exhibited in major cities around the world during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, drew millions of visitors and generated extensive media coverage, making ancient Egypt a familiar reference point in contemporary culture. The image of the gold mask appears on diverse products and in various contexts far removed from serious engagement with Egyptian history, indicating the transformation of an archaeological artifact into a symbol of mystery, wealth, and exotic antiquity. The scholarly understanding of Tutankhamun and his reign continues to develop as new analytical techniques become available for the study of the mummy and the burial goods, as inscriptions from his reign are discovered at other sites, and as the broader context of the late 18th dynasty becomes better understood through excavation and research. Questions about his family relationships, the precise sequence of events during the transition from the Amarna period to the post-Amarna restoration, the nature of political power during his minority, and the circumstances of his death remain subjects of active investigation and debate. The limitations of the evidence ensure that many aspects of his life and reign will remain uncertain, leaving room for continued scholarly discussion and popular speculation. The tomb's discovery also raised questions about the ethics of archaeological practice, the ownership of cultural heritage, and the proper disposition of human remains, issues that have become increasingly prominent in discussions of museum collections and excavation policies. The decision to display the mummy of Tutankhamun for public viewing, the removal of objects from the tomb for exhibition abroad, and the role of foreign archaeologists in the excavation of Egyptian sites all became subjects of debate about the relationship between archaeological research and national patrimony. These discussions reflect changing attitudes about the past and about the responsibilities of those who study and preserve material remains from ancient civilizations. The enduring fascination with Tutankhamun and his tomb demonstrates the capacity of archaeological discovery to capture public imagination and to create lasting interest in historical periods and cultures that might otherwise remain known only to specialists. The combination of spectacular visual appeal in the burial goods, the drama of discovery after centuries of concealment, and the poignant narrative of a young king who died before achieving his potential created a story that resonated across cultural and temporal boundaries. The contrast between the modest historical significance of Tutankhamun's reign and his overwhelming modern prominence serves as a reminder that historical memory is shaped by preservation and presentation as much as by the actual importance of events and individuals in their own time. The study of Tutankhamun's reign and burial continues to yield insights into the mechanisms of royal power in ancient Egypt, the material culture of the New Kingdom, and the religious beliefs that shaped Egyptian approaches to death and the afterlife. The tomb provides evidence for the organization of royal workshops, the sources of materials used in luxury goods, the hierarchies of craftsmen who produced objects for royal use, and the ritual practices associated with royal burial. This evidence contributes to broader understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization and to the comparative study of royal burials and elite material culture across different ancient societies. The limestone walls of the burial chamber, painted with scenes that were meant to guide and protect the king in his journey through the underworld, remain in the valley where they were created more than 3 millennia ago. Testimony to beliefs about immortality and the continuation of existence beyond death. The empty sarcophagus that once held the nested coffins sits open in the burial chamber, its lid removed during the original excavation, and the mummy returned to rest in a simple glass case. The painted decoration shows Tutankhamun in the company of gods, accepted into their realm and assured of eternal life through the proper performance of burial rituals and through the provision of the necessary equipment and provisions. The passage of more than 3,000 years since Tutankhamun's death and burial has transformed the context in which his material remains and burial goods are understood, moving them from their original function as elements in a religious system aimed at ensuring the king's successful transition to the afterlife into objects of historical study and aesthetic appreciation in museums and publications. The shift in meaning reflects fundamental changes in worldview and in the relationship between the living and the dead, changes that affect how the material remains of past cultures are encountered and interpreted. The objects retain their physical presence, while the beliefs and practices that gave them meaning in their original context have ceased to function as living religious traditions. The figure of Tutankhamun, reconstructed from skeletal remains, artistic representations, inscriptions, and historical context, emerges as a young individual born into a position of tremendous responsibility, who inherited a kingdom undergoing significant religious and political transition, who presided over the restoration of traditional practices while still a child or adolescent, and who died before reaching full maturity. The limitations imposed by genetic conditions, the burdens of office assumed at an early age, and the brief span of his life created a trajectory that ended before the full potential of his reign could be realized. The careful provision for his burial, the preservation of his body through mummification, and the assemblage of goods placed in his tomb all reflected beliefs about the continuation of existence beyond death and about the maintenance of status and identity in the afterlife. The relationship between Tutankhamun, the historical individual who lived in the 14th century before the Common Era, and Tutankhamun, the cultural icon created by modern discovery and interpretation, represents one instance of the complex processes by which the past becomes known and takes on meaning in different periods and contexts. The physical remains provide fragmentary evidence that must be supplemented by inference, comparison, and interpretation to construct coherent narratives about ancient lives and societies. The gaps in evidence ensure that reconstructions remain provisional and subject to revision as new information becomes available or as interpretive frameworks change. The burial chamber walls, with their painted scenes showing Tutankhamun welcomed among the gods, represent the aspirations and beliefs of those who prepared his burial rather than a factual record of his afterlife journey. The distinction between ritual idealization and historical reality, between the claims made in royal inscriptions and the actual exercise of power, between the artistic conventions that governed representation and the physical appearance of individuals, all complicate efforts to recover accurate understanding of the past from material remains. The tendency to project modern concerns and categories onto ancient evidence requires constant vigilance to ensure that interpretations remain grounded in the historical context rather than reflecting contemporary preoccupations. The limited written evidence concerning Tutankhamun's personality, his thoughts, his relationships with those around him, and his experience of the events that occurred during his reign leaves room for speculation, but prevents definitive conclusions about his individual character or his subjective experience of kingship. The formal nature of royal inscriptions, which follow conventional patterns of royal ideology rather than providing personal reflection, means that the voice of the king himself remains largely inaccessible. The objects from his tomb provide evidence for the material conditions of his life and for the beliefs about the afterlife that shaped his burial, but they offer only indirect and fragmentary glimpses of his inner world. The preservation of Tutankhamun's burial, while the tombs of more powerful kings were robbed in antiquity, represents an irony of historical survival, in which accident and chance determine what evidence remains available for study. The systematic robbery of royal tombs during periods of political instability and economic hardship in later Egyptian history eliminated most of the burial goods from the tombs of kings whose reigns were far more significant than Tutankhamun's. The survival of his tomb creates a distortion in the historical record, making the burial practices and material culture of this one brief reign disproportionately well documented compared to other periods. Scholars must account for this bias in the evidence when attempting to generalize about royal burial practices or about the political and cultural history of the new kingdom. The process of creating meaning from archaeological evidence involves choices about what aspects of the material record to emphasize, how to interpret ambiguous evidence, and which theoretical frameworks to apply in analysis. The study of Tutankhamun's reign and burial has involved debates about the interpretation of skeletal pathology, the significance of artistic style, the reliability of ancient king lists, and the political dynamics of the late 18th dynasty. These debates reflect broader methodological issues in archaeology and ancient history concerning the relationship between material evidence and historical interpretation. The empty chambers of the tomb, cleared of their contents during the decade of excavation work, retain traces of the paint that once covered every surface with protective spells and divine figures. The stone sarcophagus, its lid propped against the chamber wall, no longer holds the golden coffins that nested within it like a series of shells protecting the precious contents. The quiet of the burial chamber, broken only by the footsteps of occasional visitors and the hum of equipment installed to monitor environmental conditions, contrasts with the activity that must have filled this space during the 70 days of preparation for burial and the final ceremonies that sealed the tomb. The limestone cliffs that surround the Valley of the Kings continue their slow erosion under the effects of rare rainstorms and temperature fluctuations, gradually altering the landscape that has protected the royal burials for millennia. The entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb, marked with modern stairs and protective barriers, leads down into chambers that were cut from living rock by workers whose names remain unknown, who performed their labor in service to a king they may never have seen, who contributed their skills to the creation of a monument meant to last for eternity. The rock-cut chambers fulfilled their intended function of protecting the royal burial for more than 3,000 years before discovery brought the contents into the light of modern examination. The objects that once filled these chambers, now distributed in museum collections and storage facilities, continue their existence in contexts far removed from their original function. The golden mask that covered the face of the mummy, designed to present an idealized image of the king for eternity, has become a symbol reproduced countless times in various media and commercial applications. The throne, decorated with scenes of the king and queen in intimate poses, meant to provide a seat for the ruler in the afterlife, sits in a museum case where it can be examined but not used. The transformation of functional objects into museum artifacts represents a fundamental change in their status and meaning, preserving their physical form while altering their cultural significance. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover many of the objects from the tomb, providing spells of protection and identification, remain legible to scholars who have mastered the ancient Egyptian writing system, though the language in which they are written is no longer spoken. The texts preserve formulaic expressions that were repeated on countless funerary objects, standardized prayers, and invocations that followed templates established over centuries of use. The individual who inscribed these texts on the objects in Tutankhamun's tomb performed a specialized craft requiring literacy and knowledge of proper ritual formulae, contributing to the collective effort required to prepare a royal burial. The passage of time has transformed Tutankhamun from an obscure ruler known only to specialists into a familiar name recognized around the world, a transformation achieved through the survival of his burial goods and their presentation in exhibitions that have reached audiences of millions. The reversal of his historical obscurity demonstrates how preservation and presentation can override actual historical significance in shaping popular memory. The young king, who ruled briefly during a period of transition, who presided over the restoration of traditional practices without initiating major innovations, and who died leaving no surviving heir to continue his line, has achieved through the accident of preservation a fame far exceeding that enjoyed by more accomplished rulers whose tombs were robbed and whose monuments were dismantled. The study of ancient Egypt continues to evolve as new sites are excavated, as analytical techniques improve, and as theoretical approaches develop. Yet the tomb of Tutankhamun remains central to public understanding of Egyptian civilization. The completeness of the burial assemblage, the quality of craftsmanship evident in the objects, and the visual appeal of the gold and precious materials all contribute to the tomb's enduring significance. The ongoing research into the evidence from the tomb yields new insights even a century after discovery, demonstrating the value of thorough documentation and the importance of maintaining access to archaeological materials for future study. The figure of Tutankhamun has become disconnected from the historical individual who lived and died in the 14th century before the Common Era, transformed into a symbol that carries meanings shaped by modern concerns and interests rather than by ancient Egyptian beliefs and practices. The process of interpretation and reinterpretation continues, with each generation finding new significance in the material remains and constructing narratives that reflect contemporary values and preoccupations. The physical evidence remains constant, while its meaning shifts according to the questions asked and the frameworks applied in analysis. The burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings, with its painted walls showing the king's journey into the realm of the gods, represents one point in a network of royal tombs cut into the limestone cliffs over a period of several centuries. The systematic exploration and documentation of these tombs has provided extensive evidence for the development of royal burial practices, the evolution of funerary texts, and the changing iconography of the afterlife. The comparison of Tutankhamun's burial with those of other kings illuminates both the shared conventions that governed royal funerary practice and the individual variations that distinguished different reigns. The preservation of organic materials in Tutankhamun's tomb, including textiles, wooden objects, basketry, and food offerings, provides rare evidence for types of objects that normally decompose in the archaeological record. The study of these materials through modern analytical techniques has yielded information about ancient Egyptian technology, agriculture, diet, and textile production. The wooden objects, including furniture, chests, and model boats, preserve evidence for woodworking techniques and for the types of timber available to Egyptian craftsmen, some imported from distant regions beyond Egypt's borders. The royal workshop system that produced the objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb represented a significant economic institution that employed skilled craftsmen, acquired materials from distant sources, and created luxury goods exclusively for royal use. The organization of these workshops, the training of craftsmen, the transmission of technical knowledge, and the procurement of materials all required administrative systems that coordinated production and ensured quality control. The objects themselves demonstrate the sophisticated techniques available to Egyptian craftsmen, including complex metalworking methods, stone carving using copper and bronze tools, fine carpentry with intricate joinery, and the creation of composite objects combining multiple materials. The religious beliefs that shaped ancient Egyptian burial practices, including the conviction that proper preservation of the body and provision of offerings would ensure the deceased's continued existence in the afterlife, motivated the extensive preparations made for Tutankhamun's burial. The spells and rituals performed during mummification and burial, the texts inscribed on coffins and tomb walls, and the inclusion of specific objects required for the deceased's use in the afterlife all reflected a coherent system of beliefs about death and resurrection. The investment of resources in funerary equipment, which could represent a significant portion of an individual's accumulated wealth, indicates the importance attached to proper burial and the anxiety about the fate of the deceased without adequate provision. The gradual fading of Tutankhamun's name from historical memory during antiquity, followed by its dramatic revival through modern archaeological discovery, illustrates the contingent nature of historical preservation and the role of chance in determining which figures from the past remain known to later generations. The systematic efforts by Horemheb to erase the memory of the Amarna period and its immediate aftermath nearly succeeded in consigning Tutankhamun to complete oblivion, prevented only by the survival of scattered inscriptions and by his eventual inclusion in formal king lists that recorded the succession of rulers. The rediscovery of the tomb reversed this near erasure, restoring Tutankhamun to prominence through the spectacular material evidence of his burial. The empty tomb chambers, stripped of their contents during the process of archaeological excavation, retain their function as a protected space cut into the rock for the purpose of sheltering a royal burial for eternity. The painted walls, though faded from their original brightness and damaged by humidity from the breath of countless visitors, continue to show the scenes of divine welcome that were meant to guide and comfort the deceased king. The architectural space created by ancient workers using copper tools to cut through limestone remains largely unchanged despite the passage of millennia, testament to the permanence of rock-cut architecture in the dry climate of the Egyptian desert. The relationship between the physical remains of Tutankhamun and the various narratives constructed about his life, reign, and death demonstrates the interpretive distance that necessarily exists between archaeological evidence and historical understanding. The bones provide data about health, nutrition, genetic relationships, and cause of death, but they cannot speak directly to questions of personality, ambition, or experience. The burial goods indicate wealth, access to resources, and beliefs about the afterlife, but they offer only indirect evidence for political power, administrative competence, or personal relationships. The inscriptions record titles, genealogy, and standardized claims of royal achievement, but they follow formulaic patterns that obscure individual variation and personal voice. The modern scientific analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy, including CT scanning, DNA testing, and examination of the chemical composition of embalming materials, has provided detailed information that was unavailable to earlier generations of scholars. This analysis has confirmed genetic relationships within the royal family, identified specific pathological conditions affecting the king's skeleton, and shed light on the processes of mummification employed in this particular burial. The application of new analytical techniques continues to generate additional data from the physical remains, demonstrating the value of careful preservation of archaeological materials for future study using methods not yet developed. The painted decoration in the burial chamber, showing Tutankhamun in the company of gods and depicting scenes from funerary texts, represents the collaborative work of artists who specialized in tomb decoration and who worked according to established conventions governing the representation of divine and royal figures. The choice of scenes, the arrangement of text and image, and the style of execution all followed patterns that had been developed over generations of funerary art production. The specific application of these conventions to Tutankhamun's burial chamber created a unique instance of a general pattern, combining standard elements in ways particular to this tomb, while participating in broader traditions of Egyptian funerary decoration. The small size of Tutankhamun's tomb, compared to those prepared for longer-lived kings, reflects the abbreviated period available for its preparation before the king's unexpected death. The rapid completion of the burial chamber decoration, the adaptation of a non-royal tomb for royal use, and the somewhat crowded arrangement of burial goods all suggest the constraints imposed by the need to complete the burial within the prescribed period of 70 days after death. These circumstances created a burial that departed in some respects from ideal patterns while still maintaining the essential elements required for royal funerary practice. The layered coffins that enclosed Tutankhamun's mummy, each nested within the next, and featuring elaborate decoration in gold and inlaid materials, exemplified the protective function of burial equipment designed to shield the body from harm and to present an idealized image of the king. The anthropoid form of the coffins, shaped to represent the human body wrapped in mummy bandages, followed conventions that had been established earlier in Egyptian history and that would continue in use for centuries after Tutankhamun's burial. The materials employed in the construction of these coffins, particularly the solid gold of the innermost coffin, represented an extraordinary expenditure of precious metal, reflecting the importance of ensuring proper protection for the royal body. The canopic chest that held Tutankhamun's preserved internal organs, protected by the images of 4 goddesses carved on its corners and by the guardian figure placed in the chamber, represents another essential element of Egyptian burial practice designed to preserve all components of the deceased's physical being. The removal of organs during mummification and their separate preservation in canopic jars allowed for more effective desiccation of the body while ensuring that these vital organs would be available for the deceased's use in the afterlife. The elaborate decoration of the canopic equipment found in royal burials reflected the importance attached to the proper preservation of these organs and to their protection through magical means. The tomb of Tutankhamun, now empty of the burial goods that filled its chambers for more than 3 millennia, continues to receive visitors who descend the steps into the rock-cut chambers to view the painted walls and the stone sarcophagus. The physical space retains its connection to the historical moment of burial, despite the removal of most of the objects that once defined its function and appearance. The transition from functioning burial place to archaeological site to tourist destination represents successive transformations in the tomb's meaning and use, each layer of significance, coexisting with and sometimes obscuring earlier meanings. The limestone walls, bearing the marks of ancient tools, and the paint applied by artists who worked by lamplight in the confined space of the burial chamber, connect the present directly to the moment of creation in the 14th century before the Common Era. The material substance of the rock, the pigments made from mineral compounds, and the structural features cut into the cliff all persist across the millennia, providing physical continuity even as contexts of meaning and use have changed fundamentally. This continuity of physical presence amid radical transformation of cultural significance characterizes the endurance of archaeological materials and their capacity to survive the collapse of the societies that produced them.